Welcome to our deep dive, into this book that's still making people think, even though it was published way back in 1952.
Oh, wow.
Black Skin, White Masks by Frantz Fanon.
Yeah.
Now, you might be thinking a book from the 50s.
Yeah.
What could that possibly have to say about the world today? But trust me, this is just some dusty old relic.
No.
Fanon's insights into race and identity and the effects of colonialism are as sharp and relevant
Absolutely.
as...
Fanon was a psychiatrist and philosopher, writing during a time of just immense social upheaval. He was deeply involved in the anti-colonial struggles of his day, and that experience really comes through in his work. It's a powerful blend of personal reflection and sharp social critique.
And that's exactly what we're going to explore today.
Yeah.
We're going to kind of dig into some of the most thought-provoking concepts from Black Skin, White Masks, like this idea of epidermalization.
Yes.
Where the feeling of racial inferiority becomes almost like a second skin.
It's almost as if the very structure of society, the way it's built and organized, reinforces these feelings of inferiority. It's not just individual prejudice. It's woven into the fabric of our institutions. Fanon calls this sociogeny, and it's a key part of understanding the lasting impact of colonialism.
That's a really interesting point.
Makes
you think about times when you might have felt like you were being judged or treated differently based on some external characteristic, like your race, gender, or even the way you dress.
Absolutely.
It's like people see that one thing, and suddenly that's all you are in their eyes.
Exactly. And Fanon takes this idea even further with his statement. The black is not a man. Now, of course, he doesn't mean this literally. It's a deliberate shock tactic to highlight the dehumanizing effects of colonialism.
When I first read that line, it really threw me off. But then I realized that Fanon is talking about this zone of non-being that Black people are forced into, where they're constantly being defined by white society, stripped of their individuality and agency.
He argues that in this zone, it becomes almost impossible to develop a true sense of self. Because you're always seen through the lens of someone else's perception.
It's like you're stuck in a hall of mirrors, never quite able to see yourself clearly. Because all you see are distorted reflections projected by the dominant culture.
And this leads to all sorts of psychological struggles. Fanon talks about the experiences of Black people returning to their communities after being educated in Europe and the pressure they feel to measure up to white expectations.
He shares this really striking anecdote about a man ordering a beer with an exaggerated French accent, desperately trying to avoid sounding like the stereotypical nigger who eats his R's.
It's a small detail, but it reveals so much about the internalized pressure to conform, to erase any trace of your Blackness in order to be accepted. And it's not just about language. It's about adopting white mannerisms, white ways of thinking, even white standards of beauty.
It reminds me of that feeling you get when you're trying to fit in with a new group of people and you find yourself subtly changing your behavior, the way you speak, to blend in. But in this case, the stakes are so much higher.
Absolutely.
Because it's not just about fitting in, it's about survival.
And it's often a losing battle. Because no matter how hard you try to assimilate, you're constantly reminded of your Blackness, your otherness.
Fanon also talks about a woman who completely rejects her Black heritage, saying, I wouldn't be a Negro for anything in the world.
Wow.
It's heartbreaking to see how deeply ingrained these ideas of white superiority can become.
It speaks to the power of colonialism to warp not just external realities, but also internal perceptions.
It's almost as if whiteness becomes this alluring, but ultimately illusory ideal that people are constantly striving for.
And this brings us to one of the most complex and challenging aspects of Fanon's work. His exploration of the dynamics between Black women and white men. He delves into the historical context, highlighting how colonialism often created a situation where Black women were seen as objects of sexual desire for white men, while simultaneously being denied basic human dignity and respect.
He uses the example of Meata Capitia,
Yes.
a woman who saw being the daughter of a white woman as an honor, revealing how deeply ingrained these beliefs in white superiority can become.
And then there's the example of the mulatto woman who sees marriage to a white man as her ticket into the white world, a validation of her worth.
Yeah.
These examples are so powerful because they force us to confront the ways in which these dynamics might still be playing out today, even in a world that claims to be more enlightened.
It's like these historical patterns are still echoing in our present.
Absolutely.
Even if we're not always aware of them.
And I think one of Fanon's most important contributions is his insistence on connecting individual psychology to the broader social and political context.
He argues that you can't understand the psychological struggles of Black people without understanding the history of colonialism and racism that has shaped their lives.
He even uses the analysis of dreams to illustrate this point.
Okay.
He focuses on this recurring image of the Senegalese soldier appearing in the dreams of colonized people.
Okay.
And he argues that this figure represents the brutal force of the colonial regime, the ever-present threat of violence and oppression.
It's like, even in our subconscious minds, we're still grappling with the legacy of colonialism.
He uses this to critique another scholar's interpretation of Malagasy dreams, arguing that the scholar misses the crucial link to the political reality of the situation.
And it reminds us that the personal is always political.
Absolutely.
Especially when it comes to issues of race and identity.
Our dreams, our fears, our desires, they're all shaped by the world we live in, by the systems of power that surround us.
So if we really want to understand ourselves and each other, we can't just focus on individual psychology. We have to look at the bigger picture.
Yes.
The historical and social forces that have shaped our lives.
And that's one of the things that makes Fanon's work so relevant today. He's not just offering a diagnosis of the problem. He's calling for a radical transformation of our thinking. A new way of seeing ourselves and the world.
And that's where his concept of Manichean delirium comes in.
Yes.
It's this idea that our thinking about race is often trapped in these simplistic black and white categories, which ultimately prevents us from seeing each other as fully human.
He's not saying we should ignore differences, but rather that we need to move beyond this kind of binary thinking and recognize the complexity and fluidity of human experience.
It's about challenging those ingrained assumptions that often lead to prejudice and discrimination.
It's like he's saying, let's stop reducing each other to these narrow categories and start seeing each other as the complex individuals we truly are.
And this ties into his vision of a new humanism.
It does.
A world where people are free to define themselves beyond the constraints of race and colonialism.
It's a powerful vision, but it's also a challenging one.
It requires us to confront our own biases, to unlearn those deep-seated assumptions that often lead to misunderstanding and conflict.
And it's not just about changing our minds, it's about changing the systems and structure that perpetuate these inequalities.
It's about dismantling the legacy of colonialism.
Exactly.
And creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to reach their full potential.
Yes.
Regardless of their race or background.
It's a tall order, but I think Fanon's work gives us a roadmap for how to start moving in that direction.
He's really challenging us to think differently.
Absolutely.
To imagine a world beyond the limitations of our current understanding. And I think that's what makes Black Skin, White Masks such a powerful and enduring work.
It really is.
It's not just a book about race. It's a book about what it means to be human.
That's a great way to put it.
And what's truly remarkable is how his insights continue to challenge us to examine our own assumptions and biases about race and identity.
It's a book that stays with you long after you finish reading it.
I know I'm still processing a lot of what we've discussed today, but I also feel like I've gained a deeper understanding of the complexities of race and identity.
Absolutely.
And the ways in which history continues to shape our present.
I hope so, and I encourage you to continue exploring Fanon's work. There's so much more to uncover, so much more to learn from his brilliant and challenging mind.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, but we've only just scratched the surface of Black Skin, White Masks. There's so much more to uncover, so much more to learn from Fanon's brilliant and challenging work.
And I encourage you to seek out the book for yourself. to grapple with its ideas and to see how they resonate with your own experiences. Because even though it was written over 70 years ago, Fanon's voice still speaks to us today, urging us to question, to challenge, and to strive for a better world.
Absolutely.
And one of the ways we can start to dismantle those systems is by understanding how language itself can be a tool of oppression. Fanon talks about this in the context of Black people in Martinique striving to speak perfect French, even going so far as to reject their native Creole dialect.
It's almost like they're internalizing the idea that their own language, their own culture is somehow inferior.
And Fanon points out the irony of this, because even when they achieve fluency in French, they're still not seen as equals by white society.
It's a no-win situation.
It is.
You know, it makes me think about how we often associate certain accents or dialects with certain social groups. And how those associations can carry all sorts of unconscious biases.
It's a reminder that language isn't neutral. It carries the weight of history, of power dynamics, of cultural assumptions. And Fanon argues that this linguistic assimilation is another form of epidermalization, where you're essentially trying to erase your own cultural identity to fit into a mold that was never designed for you.
It's like trying to squeeze yourself into a box that's too small. Contorting yourself just to fit in.
And speaking of contorting oneself,
Fanon
also delves into this concept of negroneurosis, a term that was used in psychology at the time to describe what was seen as mental illness in Black people.
It sounds incredibly problematic.
It was. But Fanon turns this idea on its head. Arguing that what was labeled as mental illness was actually a completely understandable response to the trauma of racism and colonialism.
So instead of pathologizing Black people, he's saying we need to look at the context, the environment. That's creating these psychological struggles.
He argues that this so-called neurosis is a result of being trapped in a double bind. On the one hand, you're told to assimilate to be more like white people. But on the other hand, you're constantly reminded of your Blackness, your otherness.
It's like being told to climb a ladder where the rungs are constantly shifting, making it impossible to reach the top.
And Fanon's saying, hey, maybe it's not Black people who need to be fixed. Maybe it's the racist society they're forced to live in.
It's a radical shift in perspective.
It is.
Instead of blaming the victim, he's shining a light on the systemic forces that are creating these psychological wounds.
And this leads to another important point that Fanon makes about the internalization of racism. He talks about this phenomenon of anti-racist racism, where Black people may end up perpetuating certain negative stereotypes or distancing themselves from other Black people in an attempt to prove they're different. They're not like the others.
It's a painful reality.
It is.
But it speaks to the profound psychological impact of being constantly bombarded with messages about your own inferiority.
And it highlights the need for solidarity and unity within the struggle for liberation. Fanon argues that true freedom can only be achieved through collective action, through a recognition of shared humanity and shared oppression. He emphasizes that it's not enough to simply fight against external racism. We have to confront the ways in which it has shaped our own thinking.
You know, it's like that saying, hurt people hurt people. When you've been subjected to so much pain and injustice, it can be tempting to turn that pain inward. Or even project it onto others. But Fanon is reminding us that the real path to healing and liberation lies in recognizing our shared humanity.
Absolutely.
And finding strength in our common struggle.
And that's why his work is so challenging and so necessary. He's forcing us to confront those uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world we live in.
He's not offering easy answers, but he's giving us the tools to start asking the right questions. It feels like we've been going deeper and deeper into these layers of societal and personal conditioning.
Absolutely.
And I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. Language identity, internalized racism.
It's
all connected.
It is. And this is where Fanon's concept of Manichean delirium becomes so important. He's not just critiquing racism here.
Yeah.
He's critiquing the entire system of thought that divides the world into these rigid oppositional categories.
We've touched on it a bit already, but could you unpack that a little more?
Well, Manichean refers to a type of philosophy that sees the world in terms of absolute good versus absolute evil, light versus darkness. And Fanon argues that this kind of thinking has deeply infected our understanding of race. It leads to this oversimplified view of black versus white with no room for nuance or complexity.
It's like we get stuck in this binary thinking.
Exactly.
Which ultimately prevents us from seeing each other as full human beings.
It's dehumanizing because it denies the reality of our shared humanity. And Fanon is urging us to move beyond this. He's not suggesting that we simply ignore differences. But rather that we need to find a way to acknowledge and appreciate those differences without ranking them, without creating hierarchies of value.
So instead of trying to fit everyone into these neat little boxes, we need to embrace the messiness, the complexity of what it means to be human.
And this is where his call for a new humanism becomes so crucial. It's a vision for a world where we can embrace our shared humanity without erasing our individual and cultural identities. A world where difference isn't seen as a threat, but as a source of richness and possibility.
You know, when I think about all the conflicts and divisions we see in the world today, it seems like this idea of a new humanism is more urgent than ever.
It is.
But where do we even begin? How do we start to shift our thinking on such a fundamental level?
Well, I think Fanon would say it starts with awareness. We need to be willing to examine our own biases, to question the assumptions we've inherited from the past. It's about being open to different perspectives, to seeing the world through someone else's eyes.
It sounds like it requires a lot of humility.
It does.
A willingness to admit that we don't have all the answers.
And it's not easy work. It's ongoing. It's uncomfortable, and it requires us to constantly challenge ourselves and those around us. But I think Fanon would say it's essential work if we want to create a more just and equitable world.
He's really challenging us to think differently.
Absolutely.
To imagine a world beyond the limitations of our current understanding. And I think that's what makes Black Skin, White Masks such a powerful and enduring work.
It is.
It's not just a book about race. It's a book about what it means to be human.
And what's truly remarkable is how his insights continue to challenge us, to examine our own assumptions and biases about race and identity.
It's a book that stays with you long after you finish reading it.
I know I'm still processing a lot of what we've discussed today, but I also feel like I've gained a deeper understanding of the complexities of race and identity and the ways in which history continues to shape our present.
Absolutely.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
But we've only just scratched the surface of Black Skin, White Masks. There's so much more to uncover. So much more to learn from Fanon's brilliant and challenging work.
I encourage everyone listening to seek out the book for yourself, to grapple with its ideas, and to see how they resonate with your own experiences. Because even though it was written over 70 years ago, Fanon's voice still speaks to us today.
It really does.
Urging us to question, to challenge, and to strive for a better world.
Absolutely.